Okay, well, yeah, I mean, it's a great job, lots of fun, you're gonna glow at night. I do herbicide treatments frequently, and I'm always looking for a stronger herbicide. But so you nuked this area, and I went back out and I said to one of the ecologists at the Arboretum, I said, okay, well, where are the worms? And he said, well, I don't know, they're probably in there. And I said, we just nuked the whole area with Garland 4. Do you really think the earthworms are gonna be in there? And he was like, oh. They're all over on the area where the buckthorn still is. So it has that relationship. Buckthorn has that nitrogen relationship. Earthworms have the nitrogen relationship. So you'll frequently find, if you're looking for those piles of the leaf petioles, the middens, if you go in and you can maneuver your way through a buckthorn stand, you'll find hundreds of them. They'll be everywhere. All right, so how can you tell if you have earthworms? Okay, so pay attention. And I have a couple bags of mustard, so you can try this when you go home tonight. You look for middens, and this is a midden. And lots of different animals make middens. They say like beavers make middens, you'll see voles make middens, earthworms make middens, and it's just the leftover leaf material, and you'll see those leaf petioles. And I admit I take way too many pictures of middens because I'm always impressed by them. What earthworm is making this midden? Nightcrawler. So Lumbricus terrestris is making this midden. And it's really distinctive, you can see it. And notice something else about this particular picture. An earthworm's favorite food is a sugar maple leaf. You know, like basswood, the leaf aspen, the leaf everything. But they really don't like, what's this leaf? Oak. Because an oak holds on to their leaves far into the fall, into the spring, and a lot of times you'll see oaks persisting, those leaves persisting until you get bud out. So there's no sugar, there's no carbohydrates left in there, and so when they finally fall to the ground, there's nothing there, the worm doesn't want anything to do with it, and I always tell people, if you see worms feeding on oak leaves, you have some really desperate worms, because they don't want anything to do with it. There's nothing there for them to consume. Oops. So, and this is a borehole. So when you go up to that pile, so when you go home tonight and you're walking your dogs and you see those piles and you pull it up, there's going to be some tension when you pull that pile of leaf petioles up, because that earthworm has created a borehole. And remember, that's the nightcrawler, the terrestrials, and he or she can bore down 15, 20 feet. So you'll feel this tension. And if you pull it really, if you're careful about pulling it out, you'll see that borehole. All you do is take a little bit of mustard water, pour it straight down that borehole, and in a minute, you'll have a nice big fat nightcrawler coming right out that hole. So, really easy way to ID them. And another thing that you want to take a look at when you see this, you see the soil? This soil is all earthworm casting. So layman's terms, it's all earthworm poop. So they've processed, they've recycled, and that's what your soil looks like now because it's gone through the internal organs of an earthworm. Do you see anything up here? How many of you can pick out, how many of you see the worms in this picture? Anyone want to try? So I walked up to this and I was like, ah, look at that. And I was with another person and they were like, what are you talking about? And I said, don't you see them all? Right there, right there, right there, right there, right there. And notice, this was the first week of October. This was up in Price County. And see, the leaves are just starting to fall. And the leaves that are persisting that are still left on the forest floor are all oak leaves. The sugar maples and the aspen and the basswood, they're all starting to come down, and the earthworms are starting to get really active. So the best time to be looking for earthworms, it's always going to be spring and fall. Okay, what about here? Do you see them here? Okay, you're nodding your head. This was a really cool spot. I mean, this is a denuded forest. So each one of these little piles, you can just, follow them along. Those are all night crawlers. And when you look at earthworms and you look at the functional groups, and again, I should address this more, it falls into the three functional groups. And so we frequently will say, you all have all three functional groups of earthworms, within your natural area, within your forest. It's like the three horsemen of the apocalypse. Because when you have all three functional groups, you're going to have the most damage. And the most damaging worm by far is the nightcrawler, because it consumes everything. And I'll step back one moment. How long do you think a nightcrawler can live? Feel free to jump in.
3 years.
Oh, longer than that.
5 years?
Longer than that.
20.
5.5?
Not 25, that's a little extreme. I mean, okay, so it can live anywhere from 7 to 10 years. That's huge. It reaches reproductive stage in how many days? So it can start reproducing the cocoons. And each cocoon holds anywhere from 4 to 12 babies that are going to pop. And they're going to reach maturity in how many days? 5. That would be real. I mean, we'd be on a different planet if they were on 5. 5, that's a little fast. So,
I'm sorry.
Sure.
you have to remember, a cocoon is really tiny. You have to look through it at a lens most of the time.
45.
Anywhere from, depending on the species of terrestrius, and we have 32 different species of terrestrius in North America, it's anywhere from 90 to 120 days. So spring starts, and generally you'll start to see big masses of earthworms moving and mating mid-March, late March, early April. They only need that 90-day window to start dropping those cocoons. And these ones persist through the winter. So as soon as they come up, they start dropping the cocoons, and that's why your forest looks like this. And then you start talking about the other species of earthworms out there, and you have 21 currently in the state. And they're all doing that. That's why your forest starts to look like this, because you have too many consumers and recyclers out there, and there's not enough food for them. All right, so in the worms, I admit to what Shannon said. I can identify worms right when they come up, and it's not a talent you even want to talk about, because people always ask me, like, how, why, who would want to do that? It's a long story. I worked for a really mean herpetologist at a museum for quite a while, and I had to trump him. So now he asks me questions. So when you look at worms, this is an earthworm extraction. And you're all a lot nicer than this garden club I just gave a talk to in Chicago, because when I was talking to this woman in the crowd, we'll call her Gladys, she had blue hair, she kept saying to me, "What is an earthworm extraction? And who cares?" And I told her, just pipe down, honey. We're gonna do that. So, this is an earthworm extraction. So you clear your soil, and you have a magic powder that you put on the soil, and it brings up the earthworms. Because remember, they're annelids. They're breathing through their skin, so they don't have any internal lungs. Their whole body is a lung. So you just need to irritate them slightly. So this is just a quick picture before we get to the extraction. This is in Langlade County, so not that far from here. This is pen sedge moving through the understory. This is telling you that mutual relationship has been broken with the hypha and the mycelium. You don't have any diversity in there. This is another species of worm which falls into the terrestrius. This is rubellus. This is a distinctive pattern, so you know that you have that particular worm in your understory. And this is the understory, so you start to see that root exposure. And sedge, again, trying to stay away from it. I talked briefly about the earthworms and sugar maples. There's wide variations of why it will occur. And I have been in stands of sugar maples where I have a lot of earthworms in there, but I still have a lot of regeneration. And I can't explain that yet, but I do have fungal relationships in a fairly close area. So if that's playing something in with it, if that's why the regeneration is occurring, even though I'm losing the leaf litter, I'm not sure yet. When you look at a forest, you always want to look at a forest and you want to see thick understory growth. You want to swim through the regeneration. So when you go through a forest and you get out there and you may be afraid of the ticks, which how many of you are afraid of the ticks? Okay, well, you'll get over it. You want to walk out into that woods and you literally want to go into it swimming. So when you're out hunting this weekend and you're hunting, you want to be walking out into the woods and you want to be pushing that undergrowth away, because that is regeneration. That's diversity. That's what we want to see. But unfortunately, we don't see a lot of that. So what we're doing is we're documenting these areas where we're getting thick regeneration. This is a really nice stand of sugar maple coming up, and you can still see that distinctive duff layer in there. So that's about 5 inches thick, huge regeneration, tons of seedling. In this particular area, there aren't any worms, and that's why I'm getting that flush in there. And when you look at the invasion of earthworms, it's huge. They influence almost everything. The main things that you should pull away from here are dispersal. We move them. Wherever we go, we move them. So if you pick up soil on your shoes, you pick up that soil, there's propagules in that soil, so it could be any type of seed, it could be a root fragment, it could be a cocoon from a worm, and you're introducing it. The biological, they change the soil habitat, so therefore they change how things are growing. And invasive plants, there's a huge loss of native plants when you start to talk about invasive earthworms coming in there, because you're losing that mutualistic relationship. And extraction. So extraction is my favorite thing. Not really, but I spend a lot of time extracting. And if you want to work with kids or you want to do something fun, it's a quick, easy way to do it. You can do it. You were talking about Godzilla, that movie, right? Okay, so I saw that movie. You can do direct soil cores. You can dig them up. You can do the chemical or electrical extraction, and every year my boss gives me an article about somebody electrocuting themselves with a worm probe. Have any of you ever heard of a worm probe? They're in that movie, and it's a lot of fun. You just stick it in, and they ride to the surface. Really cool to do. I know Shane, you got one. So I don't have one because the state won't buy me one, and I could jerry-rig one, but I figured, I don't want to be found a few weeks later in a forest somewhere. So I do a lot of midden counts because I hike in a lot of places which are really remote, so it's difficult to bring in other things to do it. But earthworms, just like Superman, they have a kryptonite. So earthworms, they don't like mustard. So mustard powder is the worst thing that they've ever encountered. And all it is just regular culinary mustard, and I brought some sample bags for you, and I have 100 pounds at the DNR underneath my desk because I disperse it all over the state. You mix it with a gallon of water, you shake it up, you go out into an area that looks like where I was showing you, you see those middens. Yeah, you can drop a frame to look at it, or you can just do it randomly. That's your leaf petioles, so that's your telltale sign that they're in there. So you pull that up, shake that mustard water over it, you're going to get that worm. This is just showing earthworm sampling and extraction. When I go out there and I'm looking for worms and I'm looking for different species, I always am looking at the duff layer and I want to see how thick it is. And I'm always looking at the different species that are occurring in that particular stand. So you do these great extractions. And in here, this is a really good picture of a midden. You can see it right there. You can see one right there. See one right there. See one right there. Over there. And you just get attuned to seeing them. Like you can see them anywhere. Once you get used to it, you're like, oh, they're right there. And I've done some tricks with foresters, because if you ever spend a lot of time with foresters, you gotta impress them. They're not exactly the most engaging crowd that you want to work with. So I can tell them right away, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna pull up night crawlers out of there, and they'll be like, no, you're not. And I'm like, oh, I am. And I do. Because I can tell, just from that, looking at those middens, that that's exactly what I'm gonna get. So presently in Wisconsin, we are documenting areas of the state that remain earthworm free. It's giving us a snapshot of what native regeneration looks like. And it gives us everything that's going on there. When you look at, like, how many of you are familiar with the ovenbird? Any of you ever heard of the ovenbird? So the ovenbird is a ground nester. And a lot of times when you get a lot of earthworms in forests, you start to see declines in ovenbirds too, because they're ground nesters. Woodcock is another one. You see high incidence of woodcocks. And if you ever want to find a woodcock, just go to a logging yard or a marshalling yard where they've come out with the Ponzi and they've piled up all the logs. Go out there at 5, 6 o'clock at night, sit there, you'll see more woodcocks than you could ever imagine. It's all these little things that start to change when you get different invasives in the understory. And I'm almost done. So, like many of the world's widespread species, And maybe some of you are even too young for Men in Black, but okay, so Men in Black, the first one, the roaches, okay, so yeah, they sat in there, they drank coffee with Jay. They thrive under our influence. So again, I go back, we are the worst invasive species out there. Wherever we go, we bring stuff with us. So they're always in areas which are dominated by humans. Predation, lots of people ask me what earthworms eat. Earthworms have a lot of predators out there. How many of you have ever been out and you see a skunk pounding on the soil? Have you ever seen that? So a skunk will pound on the soil because it's making vibrations. That's making the earthworms rise to the surface and then they grab them. Opossums do the same thing. Lots of birds do it. There's cannibalistic earthworms, which is a whole other thing that I could talk for hours about. But there's lots of different things that eat earthworms. And if any of you notice that there's a huge turkey population out there, okay, so I have a theory, which I keep floating with some of the biologists in the Endangered Resources Department and the DNR, because I watch turkeys out there, because there's so much protein on the forest floor, and I mean, I've seen huge clutches of turkeys just everywhere, and they're scratching at the soil, eating the worms, because you can go up to an area where they've just scratched and been there for quite a while. They were tearing up those middens, eating all those worms. It's a theory, but it's lots of protein, quick, easy source to get it, so I don't know if anyone believes me, but we'll see in a couple of years they'll do a PowerPoint about it. What you can do, I brought lots of my stickers, wild cards, postcards, mustard, so you can try this at home. You can advertise for me. I do have a citizen science grant out there, so if any of you are interested in doing earthworm sampling for me around the state, send me an email. I have lots of places that I need people to go. And I'll end it on a couple other worms. So how many of you are interested in earthworms now? Oh, come on, at least that's one or two. Okay. All right, packed crowd. So if you're interested in earthworms, this is the Amithes. So this is the Amithes, doesn't have sex, is parthenogenic. So this is him or her. And this is a planaria flatworm. And planaria flatworms have got to be like the coolest things on Earth. So this is it. This is the New Zealand planaria flatworm. And we've had 4 occurrences of it in the state in Milwaukee. But this is a predatory worm. And what this worm does, he'll go after the nightcrawler, the Lumbricus terrestris, and he'll latch onto him with that little head right there. And in 90 minutes, he will suck the lifeblood out of that nightcrawler, and it'll just be this husk. And so the really cool thing, as we move, we keep moving new invasives everywhere. Anyone know where the nightcrawler is native to? I told you earlier, but Europe. So, but it's indigenous to England. So Great Britain, the Emerald Isles. And in the 60s, somebody brought in nursery stock from New Zealand. And this nursery stock had the New Zealand flatworm in it. And they introduced it in England, and it was outside London. And this predatory flatworm escaped. So now we go to 2013. The nightcrawler, which is indigenous to England, is now a threatened species because it's been predated upon by the New Zealand flatworm, which has dropped its population down to, it's 90% decline. So now they have a worm program in England where they actually have kids going out trying to find them so they know where they are because they're such a threatened species at this point, because this one has taken over. And I work with lots of people, that say, oh, you should release that here. But anytime you release something new, you don't know what's going to happen. So if you want to talk worms, we can talk worms, send me an email. If you want to help me in the field, send me an email. And I think that's it. And do any of you have questions? Yep.
So is there any current, just research and to see if it would even be worth trying?
To introduce this one? Oh, no, we don't want to do that. No. The ones that we found have have been at the domes in Milwaukee,
okay.
so they've come in on that stock. And so a lot of times, like the Mithies that we found on the UW campus, we know that it came in from nursery stock. So right now we have a list of 130 nurseries where they've received stock for the last, 3 years that we have to try and contact, because we know that Mithies is really aggressive in other portions of North America, and we'd like to contain it in this one area if we can, because it really would make everything else that's happening in the forest with earthworms pale in comparison, because it reaches maturity in 60 days, so it has a much quicker life cycle, and research indicated that it wouldn't survive our winters, but there's huge wintering populations in Maine and Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Vermont, so we know that it's adapting to its environment, and that's what earthworms do. Yep.
So for the epigeic worms, what happens in winter? Do they just die off?
Nope, they persist. So all of our worms, all the European worms that we have persist through the winter, they survive. So earthworms, when I talk to people and they want to go out and they want to sample, I always tell them spring and fall. Summer, you can pull some worms up out of the soil, but most worms estivate, so they aren't that active. So they tunnel down and they sort of go into a torpor, and they just hang out until they start to feel moisture, when they start to feel the vibrations of the leaf litter coming down. But yeah, it's not a good time to sample for earthworms in the dead of the heat of the summer. And there's actually, there were some declines. We had that drought. We've actually been in a drought for a long time, but we had a really droughty summer last year, and there were lots of, a great deal of earthworm mortality. So I got a lot of emails in Madison, people asking me about, like, what happened to my worms in my garden? They aren't there anymore. It got too dry, and even tunneling down and estivating, they couldn't survive that dry heat. Anyone else? Jen?
So you talk a lot about the problems with night crawlers, and we always hear in general earthworms are bad. But does some species of earthworms are they just pretty
Benign.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so a lot of the epigeic species, they're not a huge concern. When you have them in a forest, you have them in the forest. They're not doing a whole lot of damage. They're smaller, they're less active. And so, there's a whole list of them that, if I pull them out, I'm like, it doesn't even matter. I'm looking for the game changer. When I start to see the game changer moving into the forest, that's when we start to see things happening elsewhere. But yeah, I mean, you can have a really healthy forest and have epigeic species in there, but their populations will be much lower, and they'll be dispersed farther out. They won't be clumping and fighting for a food source like the night crawlers do.
prairie effects? I mean, we talk about forests. I know you're a forest specialist, but
Prairie pits. So yeah, I mean, and that's, Curtis Prairie, so Curtis Prairie in the Arboretum, there's a grad student that's doing earthworm surveys in there. So after we had found the Amithes, and so now I'm telling you where it is. So it's in the Arboretum. Don't spread that because we're trying to keep it under wraps. But the Amithes, the worm that we found, the Asian one, it's in the Arboretum, and it's in the area where it is, it's relatively close to Curtis Prairie. So it's close to this prairie area, and so I initially did some surveying just in the perimeters of Curtis Prairie, and I couldn't find any in there. And the grad student that's doing the surveys over a 3-year period, her, looking at her data, she hasn't encountered them either. But in a prairie, you will get earthworms, but you won't get the density that you'll get in a forested setting, because it's a prairie species and it's different soil. So a lot of times you'll get you'll get red wigglers or leaf worms in there. You'll get some apreca. You'll get some, just random ones that don't do a whole lot of damage. You'll rarely get night crawlers in a prairie. So, yep. All right, so I expect to see you all working at the DNR in right? And again, I brought samples, so try it. It's a lot of fun. You'll squeal with delight. And
All right, thank you very much.